We are moving in with my parents as of today. There shouldn't be any problems because they are my own parents, right? But my spouse made this really unexpected proposal. I was really caught off guard by his abrupt proposal because he hadn't given me any prior indications. I could not believe what I was hearing, so I stood there stunned and on the edge of tears. This sudden change occurred only a few days after my father's burial, who had died after a protracted illness. My spouse seemed to ignore my pain, despite the fact that we had just said our last goodbyes and the turbulent emotions from the burial were still raw. He made the decision that we would leave our house without taking my sentiments into account. I was shocked to learn that he had decided to move us into a villa my father had left me. I discovered that my in-laws had moved in before we arrived. I'm 29 years old, and my name is Victoria. In addition to being a product designer, I recently started my own company. Matthew and I started our lives together and were married 5 years ago. My profession is recognizing me, and my career is thriving. I'm doing well enough financially to own our flat. My father was diagnosed with malignant cancer last year, and my mother passed away during my time in college. He courageously battled while receiving therapy as the illness approached its last phase. Our family physician had counseled us to assume the worst. I had maintained constant communication with my dad ever since I moved out on my own. I loved him dearly, and his sickness was a devastating blow. It was excruciating to see him decline day by day, and I frequently found myself laying awake at night, nervous and worried. My spouse inquired about my father's health on a regular basis, but he never seemed to be genuinely concerned. It seemed as though all he could do was wait for the inevitable. My spouse frequently felt inferior to me during our relationship, maybe due to the underlying financial consequences, as I made more money than he did. Rather of recognizing my successes, he put me to the test, displaying a childlike side that was more interested in rivalry than in offering assistance. I had hoped for his understanding and encouragement during these difficult times. And now here we were, relocated into what ought to have been a place of solace and remembrance for my father, but instead it seemed like a battlefield of feelings, unspoken expectations, and circumstances in which he maintained control. My father always advised me to put my marriage first and not worry about him. But in order to prevent regrets later, I thought it was imperative that we see him while we still had the opportunity. I was finding it more and more difficult to keep my mounting annoyance with my spouse hidden as time went on. His love seemed real in the early days of our marriage, and we had a lot of joyous times together. However, his callous remarks regarding my father's condition became intolerable. The kind and caring spouse I had known had changed by the time I realized it, and I found it difficult to embrace this new side of him. My spouse said that having someone there was too distracting, even though I also intended to work from home after launching my own company. I thus acquired a modest office and started traveling by car. It was simple for me to visit the hospital where my father was receiving treatment because it was on my route. But my spouse stayed home all day, leaving me to take care of all the domestic duties. I was worn out from juggling job, taking care of my father, and running the household. Every day when I came home, I saw the mess my spouse had made and the unused dishes he had used. He led a conceited life, totally insensitive to my feelings. I became aware of his lack of empathy while living with him, and I had a strong sensation of isolation. My father then passed away. We talked to him about selling our family home. My spouse looked preoccupied even while I busied myself with the funeral arrangements, either talking on the phone or being completely silent. I begged Matthew to assist me, especially now. But his phone rang right then. He chuckled and said, "I've been getting so many work calls," after hanging up. My disillusionment and resentment for him grew inside. Maybe the abrupt loss of my father intensified these emotions even more. His expression grew issier, and I was overcome with despair. He talked to his parents alone for a considerable amount of time on the day of the burial. I felt much more alone when they came back, grinning, and drawing strange looks from other guests because of their actions. Despite this, the funeral was effectively completed, and the cremation and inheritance processes proceeded without a hitch. My spouse teasingly proposed, "Let's move in with my parents starting today, following the death of my father. It shouldn't be an issue because they are my parents, right? If you disagree, perhaps we ought to think about divorcing." He said it with a laugh, but I couldn't remain calm after hearing his unreasonable proposal, especially in the midst of my grief. "How can we live together? We don't have any spare rooms in this apartment, do we?" I challenged him. In reality, one room in our apartment was used as an office and to store my husband's work materials. Since we didn't have children, he used this room quite freely. "It's that villa you inherited," he replied with a smile. I was taken aback. While we had sold the family home, the villa was a special place dear to both my father and me, filled with cherished memories. I intended to keep it as a tribute to him. However, my husband seemed indifferent to my sentiments and continued to push his own desires. "I hope you understand that living in that villa would be very hard for me," I tried to explain, but he appeared not to listen. His parents had already terminated their apartment lease and decided to move into the villa. It seemed they had planned their move during my father's funeral, drawn by the villa's spaciousness and its peaceful location. Their relocation was already underway, and I felt my objections would be futile. Whenever I expressed my feelings, my husband openly showed his annoyance. "You always think about yourself. You've been away from home so much due to your father's illness and those sudden emergency calls. Do you realize how much I've tolerated because of your obsession with your father?" His words were harsh and uncaring, darkening my world further. "Now that your father has passed, you should listen to me," he continued. It took him a whole year to die, which was way too long. His cold, heartless remarks filled me with shock. I didn't want to believe that this was the real nature of my husband, but it was becoming painfully clear he had little respect for both my father and me. I remembered the pained expressions on my father's face as he lay on the narrow hospital bed. My father would never have wanted to leave his only daughter behind to merely obey her husband's insensitive demands. My husband's lack of empathy was disheartening, and I felt increasingly isolated in my grief and my fight to preserve my father's memory. At that moment, I felt my affection for my husband completely dissipate. My heart tightened as I thought about his apparent joy over acquiring the villa during a time I should have been mourning my father's passing. Despite the turmoil within, I kept my emotions in check and warned him, "You can try living in the villa, but don't come to regret this decision later." He seemed resolute, so I reluctantly agreed to his plan. Packing only a few essentials, I left our home. My husband looked puzzled at my scant belongings, but all I said was, "I'll come back for the rest later." Honestly, I had no desire to speak another word to him. It was painful to face my in-laws, who seemed to have eagerly anticipated my father's death and were now moving into the villa with glee. I followed my husband in silence. The one thing I couldn't reconcile with was the thought of my cherished place falling prey to his caprices. The villa, technically a single-family home by the sea, is situated in an ordinary neighborhood, yet remains conveniently accessible from the city center. Its land is highly valuable. We exited the station, and the familiar scenery of my childhood unfolded before me. Back then, my mother was still alive, and I remember how my father would carry me on his back all the way home after I'd fallen asleep during a train ride. When we arrived at the villa, my in-laws were already inside, suspicion nodding at me. It seemed my husband had secretly taken the key and, unbeknownst to me, given a duplicate to his parents. This realization heightened my unease. The stealthy manner in which my in-laws had planned their move into the villa without consulting anyone only deepened my distrust. As I looked around, I saw the gleam of anticipation in my in-laws' eyes as they envisioned their new life in our family home. The villa, filled with sturdy furniture, my father had carefully chosen an eclectic European-style furnishings, likely chosen by my mother, held sentimental value. They seemed oblivious to its significance. What a lovely villa! Isn't it perfect? Goodbye to living in that cramped apartment. It's such a blessing that we get to live here from now on, they exclaimed. The view from the second floor is indeed stunning. I couldn't help but remember my father's discreet pride in this special place, a sharp contrast to the insensitive excitement of my in-laws. In the midst of their excitement about inheriting what they called a marvelous house of secrets, my husband and his parents' ecstatic remarks only added to my irritation. They seemed to completely overlook the emotional weight of my father's passing. Treating the villa merely as a luxury property they were fortunate to inherit. Both the location and the house are impeccable. I'm grateful he left us this magnificent villa. We must thank your father, my husband said thoughtlessly, laughing along with his parents as they opened beers to toast their new living arrangement. As I prepared some snacks for them, the cherished memories of times spent with my parents around the dining table felt overshadowed and tainted by the current turmoil. I decided to conceal my emotions and endure through the night. The next morning was abruptly disrupted by my mother-in-law's shrill scream echoing through the villa, instantly altering the mood. As I rushed to find out what had happened, I found her on the bathroom floor, clutching her foot with a look of panic. The floor just gave way beneath me. She gasped, still breathless from the shock. My husband and father-in-law seemed perplexed. The floor looks fine. You probably just slipped, they suggested, casually dismissing her concerns. They examined the spot she pointed out, but the floorboards were smooth and perfectly aligned. Still, she insisted, I'm sure the floor collapsed. As they continued their superficial check, I intervened. Have you tried stepping on that slightly differently colored part of the floor? I asked. Surprised, they all turned their attention to the area I indicated. I stepped forward, pressed down on the discolored section with my slivered foot, and immediately the floorboard made a clear sound and slightly sank. However, the moment I lifted my foot, it snapped back into place. What was that? They exclaimed in unison. If someone stepped on it unknowingly, they'd surely think the floor had collapsed. See, the floor sinks a bit. It's kind of like a trap. I explained that it's dangerous. Is this house defective? They reacted with newfound concern. Their previous disregard for the villa's sentimental value to me seemed momentarily forgotten as they faced the unexpected reality of its physical imperfections. I calmly explained the situation, and they all stared at me in surprise and skepticism. It's not a defect, I said. My father intentionally installed these features. This house is what you might call a mechanical mansion or a trick house. Why would he do that? They asked, puzzled. Well, my father was a huge enthusiast of ninjas. He spent a lot of time and money on this villa, which was both his pride and joy and a treasured chest of his creativity. As a child, I often came here while he tweaked the house's mechanisms or installed new ones. That's why the villa is filled with traps and clever mechanisms. A shelf you shouldn't touch, a floorboard that drops when stepped on, a door that only opens following a specific sequence, hidden doors, and even secret rooms. This house is filled with my father's dreams, and his inventive spirit honed over many years. Of course, this place is suited for daily life for someone like me. Having visited since childhood and being taught by my father how to operate all these traps, I have no issues navigating them. It's a different story for my husband and in-laws who are unfamiliar with it. I did warn you that living in this villa would be difficult. I did warn you. I also told you it's a place filled with my father's memories. My father's extreme interest in ninja-related gadgets was well known among our relatives. The real surprise was that my husband and his parents were unaware of it at first. My husband claimed he hadn't heard about it, but now he was at a loss for words. My in-laws were equally shocked by this newfound information. Having already canceled our apartment lease, and with nowhere to return to, they pressed my husband on what to do next. In the midst of their confusion, both my father-in-law and husband accidentally triggered another trap, causing them to fall. Seeing the two of them sprawled on the ground, I couldn't help but chuckle. "Please feel free to stay as long as you like," I said, my tone more mocking than genuine. They had been captivated by the luxury of the villa, ignoring my warnings and showing no interest in my father's hobbies. Now their oversight was coming back to haunt them. Even my explanations about the dangers of the traps seemed to fall on deaf ears. "This isn't a big deal. We'll get used to it," my husband finally responded with forced confidence. I just smiled knowingly, acknowledging his comment, but aware of the steep learning curve they faced living in a house filled with my father's clever but complex contraptions. I told them I would head back to the apartment to prepare for our move. However, in reality, I had no intentions of moving. Instead, I planned to take a few days off to sort through my father's belongings, finding solace in the quiet and the time alone. It allowed me to slowly regain a positive outlook and start planning my new life. Within just 2 days, my husband and in-laws had reached their limit living in the villa, the Trick Mansion. Meanwhile, my father's villa has started to become a minor tourist attraction in the neighborhood. It was regularly featured in local newsletters as the Trick Mansion nestled within a residential area. Whenever the villa was occupied, curious locals and visitors intrigued by its reputation would come to see the famous house. I remembered times when strangers toured the villa and local children played around it, adding life and vibrancy to the place. My father had listed both the villas and our former home's phone numbers in the newsletters. However, since the family home's number was now inactive, any inquiries would redirect to the villa's number. Thanks to my upbringing, I was proficient in foreign languages, which allowed me to handle calls from international visitors easily. My husband and in-laws, however, struggled with this. They couldn't understand foreign languages and were already overwhelmed by the nerve-wracking lifestyle of avoiding the house's many traps. Exhausted, sleep-deprived, and overwhelmed by the constant barrage of unexpected visitors and challenging phone calls, they stumbled back to the apartment. "Why don't we all just live in this apartment together?" "Think about it," they suggested, desperate to escape the villa. They had eagerly awaited my father's demise to claim the villa, but ironically, they couldn't handle living there for even 2 days. Instead of serving them tea, I handed my husband the divorce papers, which I had already filled out and stamped. "There's no way we can live together if you understand. Just leave quickly," I explained with a deep sigh. I couldn't forgive him for his insensitivity and the way he had disregarded my feelings. Without any discussion or explanation, he had decided we would live with his parents. He had never shared household responsibilities with me before and had comfortably dumped them all on me during our time at the villa. I felt cornered and overwhelmed, yet he seemed completely indifferent to my struggles. As my husband and his parents stood before me in our apartment, I realized I couldn't continue living with someone so selfish. His actions had spoken louder than any promises he could make. Now what happened? "You used to love me, right?" he asked, bewildered by my cold demeanor. I couldn't help but scoff at his naive question. How can you expect me to love someone who secretly wished for my father's death and rejoiced when he passed? I retorted, my voice firm without a hint of regret. I handed him the divorce papers and firmly instructed both of them to leave the apartment. "First of all, this is my apartment. If anyone should leave, it's you," I declared. When my husband raised his voice, careless of the disturbance it caused our neighbors, I replied, "Victoria, I'll call the police for trespassing if you don't leave quietly. Do you not remember this apartment is under my name?" I reminded him calmly. They fell silent, the gravity of the situation dawning on them. They had depended on me financially, and now without much of their own, they faced a stark reality. Determined to sever ties before they could begin their lengthy persuasions, I watched as they left. Neither my husband nor my in-laws had substantial savings. After being evicted from the apartment and unable to return to the villa, they found themselves in a cheap, low-quality apartment, struggling to make ends meet. The previous apartment was better, they often lamented. Initially, my husband felt guilty and apologized repeatedly. However, over time, his guilt turned to resentment towards his parents. Due to their age, they worked infrequently, and their efforts were short-lived. Eventually, they exhausted their savings and pension. The constant arguments led them to become estranged as a family. The walls of their new apartment were thin, barely containing their daily disputes. Even when they received noise complaints, they never apologized. Instead, they responded with hostility, making them unpopular with their neighbors. It seemed inevitable that they would need to find another place to live soon. My husband, who had previously enjoyed the convenience of working from home, now found himself in a cramped space without a proper workspace. This severely affected his ability to concentrate, and consequently, his reputation and sales suffered. He barely scraped by with a late-night job at a convenience store and was considering taking on multiple part-time jobs to survive. The in-laws, in their moments of clarity, realized that allowing their son to make decisions for them was their biggest mistake. In their frequent arguments, they blamed the villa's traps and each other. "If you had been more responsible, we wouldn't be in this situation. Don't blame me now. She's the one who kept important things secret." After the divorce, they would argue, pointing fingers but never accepting their part in their downfall. After the divorce, my career as a product designer took a significant leap forward. To process the grief of my father's death and the turmoil that followed, I channeled my creativity into designing with a unique twist, incorporating ninja elements inspired by my father's interests. I showcased these designs on social media, where they quickly gained popularity. To my surprise, a major cosmetics company reached out, intrigued by my work. They wanted me to design packaging with an Asian touch, integrating ninja motifs. Embracing this project, I saw it as a way to preserve and honor my father's cherished memories. The project turned out to be a tremendous success, catapulting my career to new heights. At my parents' graves, I enjoyed updating them on my accomplishments and sharing how their legacy has continued to influence my work. I made the decision to maintain the villa and turned it into a mechanical house, a unique space that brings back memories of my father. I created a safe area for visitors and local kids to explore and enjoy at no cost by organizing tour schedules and making minor adjustments. The mansion soon became the subject of extensive media coverage. This exposure brought in a great deal of money, which helped with continuing expenses. Internet articles about the house were also translated into other languages, attracting interest from followers throughout the world. Some of them elderly aficionados who shared my father's enthusiasm for ninjas. I committed my life to maintaining this enchanted location. The mechanical home developed into a center of everyday activity, particularly among the kids in the area. Is this the fabled mechanical home that I have been told about? The tricks are where? They would ask with excitement. Show us. We implemented safety measures so that everyone could play without risk, with the assistance of neighborhood volunteers. A few characteristics that notably captivated foreign visitors were the concealed doors and buried floorboard. Whoa, this is incredible. I'm quite touched to have visited such a special location. Are there any more tricks here? They would frequently ask. Despite the fact that I lost my father and got divorced because I inherited the property, I believe the benefits have outweighed the drawbacks. The villa has evolved into a place filled with memories that I now enjoy spending time in with loved ones and guests. It has also sparked a personal metamorphosis, enabling me to go on with a resurgence of hope and optimism.